Good afternoon. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines, where we take you behind the scenes in our newsroom here at the Post and Courier. I'm Mitch Pugh, executive editor of the Post and Courier. I'm joined today by two of our Understand SC podcast hosts, business reporter Emily Williams and photojournalist Gavin McIntyre. Thank you for coming out today as we all await the possible storm here later this afternoon. So I hope everybody's staying safe and is battened down and ready. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about Understand SC. It's a podcast we've been doing for quite some time, I think since 2019 here at the Post and Courier, but it's gone through some changes and some new hosts, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So for those of you who aren't as familiar, Understand SC is a weekly podcast from the Post and Courier, explains some of the important issues that our state is grappling with, takes you a little bit deeper into the hows and the whys. Kind of our goal here is to use our reporting resources and our staff and our expertise to help you better understand what's happening in South Carolina and how you can best go about living in South Carolina. The show is produced by Emily Williams, Gavin McIntyre, who are both here with us today, and digital producer Matt Rasnick, who couldn't make it today. I thought we'd get started just with a little bit, let you each know a little bit more about Emily and Gavin. So I'll start with y'all. Maybe tell us a little bit more about what you do here at the Post and Courier and why and how you got interested in podcasting. And Emily, we'll start with you.
Sure. Excited to be talking more about the podcast today. So as Mitch said, I am a business reporter. I first got started with the podcast because I was on the show a few times talking about things that I was reporting about. I believe the first one was talking about hotel development in the Charleston area. So I started out being a guest a couple of times, and then I guest hosted a couple of times. And actually that was just about a year ago, a little bit more than that. And after guest hosting for a couple of episodes, the pandemic hit and we went remote and we had to figure out how to start podcasting remotely. So I started doing it every single week. So it's interesting timing on that. So been with the show for the whole time that we've been figuring out how to make it during this different time of work.
Great, thanks. Gavin, so tell us a little bit more about what you do as a photojournalist and how you got involved and interested in podcasting.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. So I've been here for about a year and a half now, and I'm a photojournalist with the paper. And basically, I just go out into the community and cover daily assignments for the paper, from food stories to breaking news, like today for the storm possibly, and special projects sometimes. And so that's how I kind of first got on the podcast, was talking about photos I took during last summer during the protest. And so I always love the format because it gives the reporters and photographers a chance to explain more about what we do and particularly go behind the scenes of some of the stories and photos we take. And so I was a big fan when I got here, and I remember kind of reaching out to Emily about like, hey, if you ever, need a possible guest host, I'd love to be on it. And then she asked me one day if I'd like to co-host, and I just jumped at the chance.
Great, that's awesome. Well, I know one of the things about the show that's interesting is it's changed a little bit since we first launched in 2019. We had a whole different cast of characters as hosts, and as any organization, a news organization does, people come and go. So there's been some changes and some shifts over time. So maybe I'll start with Emily. Emily, can you talk a little bit about how the show has changed and the way that you're approaching it today?
Definitely. So like I said, I kind of came into it at an interesting time since we were in the middle of a pandemic. But I would say that prior, the show was a little bit more of just a conversation with other reporters. And I liked that format. I enjoyed it, but I thought it'd be great. I listened to a lot of other news podcasts, and I wanted to have some direct interviews, not just with reporters, but also a mix of reporters, bringing in, for example, a politician. We directly interviewed Nancy Mace for an episode a couple of months ago, for example. Several medical professionals in the area, about COVID-19. So it's become more of that mix of, yes, those conversations with reporters that go behind the scenes. Sometimes that's more the focus of a whole episode, but you're getting more of that mix of hearing directly from those sources, which I think is interesting too. You mostly hear them quoted in our stories. It's interesting to hear them respond to a question in real time. So now it's more of a mix of both of those things.
Gotcha. Hey, Gavin, on that note, I mean, I know you joined, in the last several months on this. How's that been, interviewing outside guests versus interviewing the journalists that you work with every day? I mean, how do you approach those two different? I mean, do you approach those kinds of shows differently, or are they the same? How would you characterize the pros and cons, I guess, of interviewing people you already know because you work with them versus a source or an outside person?
I think interviewing someone in the newsroom, there's a little bit more familiarity because we work with them on a daily basis. And, when they come in, it's kind of like we would talk about a story in the newsroom. And Emily could probably go into this a lot more than me because she reaches out to a lot of the sources. But talking to someone like an outside source, there's a little bit of a process to go through about what we kind of want to talk about, the topics of the podcast, and, overall issues we hope to focus on.
Gotcha. So while I've got you on that topic, I mean, since you've been on, who's been your favorite guest or person to interview so far? That was one of the questions that a lot of our readers asked. So
I think it was, so I worked with Jennifer Berry Hawes on a project called Forgotten History, and we were interviewing people she talked to for different locations that she told throughout the project. And one of them was the descendant of a painter who worked here on Charleston along Calhoun Street. And it was just amazing to hear her talk about her family and her family's history and go into more detail about things that couldn't necessarily be, told all of it in the story because, we can't tell everything. And so it gave her a chance to go into more detail about her family.
So, Emily, I know, like I said, a lot of our readers were asking us to ask you all what's been your favorite podcast episode or your favorite guest. So I'll kind of throw the same question at you. Is there one or two episodes that stand out to you as being sort of highlights?
Yeah, I think this is a good thing. I feel like my favorite episode to do is changing every week because I do feel like one, more reporters are learning how to do it. They're getting more comfortable with it. The more that we do it, the better that can be. So I think it's changing every week. But a few of the interviews that I've really enjoyed, I would agree with Gavin on that one. Just a really interesting, some personal experiences that she could share there. I would also say too, for Black History Month, I interviewed Cecil Williams, the civil rights photographer, and I'd met him before. I wrote about him in 2019 when he opened his own civil rights museum, pretty much single-handedly in Orangeburg, South Carolina. So it was really interesting to reconnect, and I had already met him, but I didn't get to have that broader conversation about how did you first pick up a camera? How did you come to photograph Thurgood Marshall at age 14? It was just a really interesting conversation to have with him, and helped that, like I said, I'd met him before, had written a story about him before, but it was a different kind of conversation.
Gotcha. And I think you raise a good point that these are different conversations. It's a different way of looking at stories and topics that we are covering in sort of the more traditional newspaper format. So Gavin, can you talk a little bit about how you guys approach who you think this audience is for the podcast and how that might be a little bit different from the audience that reads the traditional print newspaper?
Yeah, so obviously, understand SC. So the point is it's a broad audience, obviously, because we're reaching out, to South Carolina. Sometimes we have specific focuses depending on the story when it's more Charleston, or maybe it might bring a story from Greenville or Myrtle Beach or Columbia now that we've started to expand and really cover the whole state. But I think it allows people who might not want to necessarily pick up the print product, or maybe they don't have time to sit down with the story, if they can, put on a podcast, on a drive home, or, while they're doing some type of, activity or something, I think it gives them a chance to still be in touch with like the daily news, but not have to necessarily sit down and really, take a time out of what they might possibly do something else.
Gotcha. One of the questions that I got from a reader is that they've noticed there have been some bonus episodes lately. And I know that's part of the way that you guys are starting to rethink the podcast. So, you want to talk a little bit about bonus episodes, what those are, and can regular Understand SC listeners expect more of those?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the ways that we'll decide that is feedback too. So if anyone's listening today and they like those bonus episodes, let me know. But so far, it's been in a couple of instances where we have a story that really works for our main episode, which is about 30 minutes every week. It usually doesn't vary anywhere between 25 and 35. It's always in that range. So it has to be something that you can get really several different conversations around. It has to be something that has a little more to it. But then we found there are some where I think I would love to have a 10-minute update about this, but it's not quite enough for that full weekly episode. So for example, we'd already done an episode about the vaccine rollout and a lot of the complications with that, going into some of those details. But then when the requirements were expanded again, we put out a 10-minute episode the day that that expanded, with basically just the basics of who is now included, what does this change. So I'd love to do more of those. Again, would love to have feedback from people. The idea is that when we have those bonus episodes, they aren't that full episode. It's more those quicker bites of news at different points in the week.
Gotcha. One of the things that I know that I've heard from other folks that do podcasting on a regular basis is it sort of changes the relationship you have with some of your readers and audience members, because they start to feel like they get to know you. So, Gavin, have you experienced that? Has anybody come up to you and said, "Hey, are you the guy from the podcast?" I've heard that from people that have been on the podcast or hosted the podcast. I mean, do you feel like it's changed your relationship with Post and Courier readers and audience members?
Unfortunately, I haven't had anyone come up to me yet, but yeah, I would gladly welcome, meeting, anyone who listens, because we appreciate, hearing from our listeners and people who subscribe to the newsletter, which please do. Please subscribe to the Understand SC newsletter and reach out, because, it allows us to, really create different episodes that might work better for our audience, and also gives us suggestions maybe we didn't think of a topic, or maybe there was a story we did that we didn't address something, and maybe we can return to in a later story. But yeah, if anyone ever just sees me around with my cameras, please come up to me, because I'd love to chat about the podcast.
Well, on that note, Gavin, you kind of started to get into that. How do you guys go about selecting topics, figuring out what makes a good episode of the podcast? And I'm sure stuff comes your way that people want you to do, especially from the newsroom folks, that maybe doesn't fit. So how do you make those decisions, and how do you guys discuss and collaborate? Is there a weekly meeting? What's that look like?
So we have a running schedule that is very much a living document, I'd say, because it being a weekly show, I always want it to feel newsworthy. So I would say the plan can change, pretty quickly before the episode comes out, just because we want it to still feel fresh. So even if we planned that this is going to be that episode in that week, well, something big happens, that could change. But the big things that we're looking for, I think, like I mentioned a little bit, is it needs to be something that typically it's not something that there's a single story that's been written about it. It's something that's more of a broader topic that a reporter or a few reporters have been following. So it's something that has been developed more over time, and also interested in doing some more now that people are getting their vaccines. We're getting out and about in the community a little bit more. looking for some more stories that might give us the opportunity to not just do a remote interview, but maybe get some audio out in the field, talk to people at a particular, location. So I'm looking for those going forward. I would say prior, looking for things that doesn't require that, since we're mostly trying to do things remotely. But I would say that's the big thing, is when you'll notice that for the most part, the podcasts are, and we always include our related reading. It's a lot of different stories, maybe 5 to 6 different stories, because it's something that's been reported on for at least enough time that, like I said, we have enough to talk about.
Sure. Gavin, kind of being a newer member of the podcast team, I mean, is there anything in particular that you're looking for when you're talking about topics or things that kind of resonate with you that you want to make sure we include in the podcast?
I think, what Emily was saying, just like stories that we've kind of delved into, where we have a lot of material to work from and can reach out, maybe not to the reporter, but, do a little bit of our own reporting on the story and bring people on to talk to. Also, I think it's fun just to bring some of the more fun stories. Like I remember talking to Avery about the South Carolina state flag, which was a fun episode to do. And so it's like, sometimes we bring on like more fun stories, not strictly always, maybe a harder news topic, but sometimes we like to just chat and just have a fun time talking about this story that might have the community like really buzzing.
Yeah, they were a little fired up about that flag, weren't they?
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. We do look out for the stories that are really popular, and sometimes that will be for example, a reporter in Greenville had a long reported piece about Bilo, the grocery chain, and prior to seeing how popular that was, I wasn't thinking, that would make a good podcast, but then I realized that actually makes a really good episode, and that's one that we found was downloaded more, outside of our area. I think just because of the regional appeal of, there are several states that have Bilo stores. So we're definitely also looking for the stories that seem to be capturing that interest and that people might want to listen to more beyond what they've read.
You mentioned the Bilo story, and that was one of the questions I was going to ask you all, is what have been some of the more popular, most downloaded episodes that in recent months that have seemed to have really resonated?
The one that Gavin was talking about that paired with Jennifer Hawes' project about forgotten history, that one did really well as well. COVID-related episodes, definitely, especially when there are bigger developments, and also the fun ones. I would say too, political episodes too. We had more of those around the election. One of them a little more recently, but leading up to the election, I believe we had either 4 or 5 episodes in a row that were all politically focused and had our politics reporters, and those were all popular.
Gotcha. One of our readers, listeners, Michael Williams, asked a question. He wanted to know, what do you do if you're talking to a guest about coming on the podcast and they request something to be off limits or not to be talked about? How do you handle that? Have you run into that? And what is your general philosophy about giving guests that kind of leeway?
I haven't run into that with the podcast yet, but I think it's that really depends on the situation. Sure. If a politician is saying that to me, that's probably not going to fly. If it's a community member and we're talking about something sensitive, something personal, that could be a different situation. We haven't run into that yet, like I've said, but I do think because we really do have to plan these in advance. It's not just calling someone up, as we often do for writing a story. So you do get that opportunity to have a conversation with someone before you actually start recording. So I feel like the expectations are usually very clear on what we're talking about, which is nice.
That makes a lot of sense. So one of our readers, listeners, Cecil Gelber, was asking a little about how you approach. So you mentioned COVID stories being very popular, and they were saying, how do we get people vaccinated? How do you guys, so Gavin, how do you approach that when you're talking about a topic like vaccinations? Because I don't think you guys are trying to advocate for one position or another, but certainly you understand that part of the job as a journalist is to educate the public. So how do you balance education versus making sure you're not advocating?
That's a good question. So yeah, so we're not trying to advocate saying, you should go get this vaccine, or, we try to, when we speak with, a doctor or, one of our reporters, we kind of let them kind of explain, the details of the vaccination process, what's happening with DHEC, and kind of let them kind of fill in that information without so much of us saying like, oh, this is the vaccine you can get here, or, this is like, like advocating for a particular thing. We kind of let the reporter or the outside source kind of bring like the info and the facts to the listener.
Makes a lot of sense. One of the questions that I was kind of curious about, because I'm not, like a lot of the folks that are on here listening today, I'm a podcast listener. I like different podcasts. I listen to our podcast. I listen to others. I'm sure a lot of our listeners would like to know kind of what your favorite podcasts are. So Emily, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Gavin. What are a couple of your favorite podcasts, and why do you think they're successful and interesting?
Sure. It's hard to just say a couple. I listen to a lot. So I have a lot on my daily rotation, I would say. When we're talking news podcasts, I listen to NPR's Up First thing every morning. One, because it is posted early, and it's also just, it's a great digest. It's really efficient, I think. And I usually end my day with the Washington Post's post reports. And I think that one's really effective, because I do think they have a great blend of talking to their reporters, and also it seems they've worked with a lot of their reporters to get them recording things out in the field, so that then they can pull from that. So I feel like I've gotten a lot of ideas from that. I also listen to Axios's podcasts every day. Those are very, I would say, even more efficient. I guess that's very much their style, but it's also just interesting. That's a newer daily podcast, and I've been enjoying that. And then I would say for not news and not daily podcasts, I just think Radio Lab is such a standard of like great narrative podcast. And then I'd also say a show, Throughline, I would very much recommend. That's really about history, but tying it to current events. That's been one of my favorite shows the last year.
Gotcha. Gavin, what about you? What are some of your favorites?
Well, one, This American Life, which I feel like is the obvious one, but I remember working on an assignment with Emily, and she played an episode where they went to a New York rest stop, and just the fascinating, aspect of who works there and the people who stop there. And so since then, I always listen to This American Life. And then it's called The Big Picture, and it's through The Ringer, and it's a movie podcast. And, it's interesting because they, kind of bring a different aspect to talking about movies, and not just sticking to like, oh, this is why it's good, this is why it's bad. They really get into like the actor's history and, the kind of the more business side of the movie industry. So that's one I've been listening to a lot lately.
Cool. On that note, I'll put a little pitch in for similar with The Ringer. Rewatchables is a great podcast where they go back and watch old movies that are like constantly on your television. It's pretty fun. We got a reader question while we were talking from Montez Martin. Want to know, who do readers and listeners reach out to if they have suggestions, ideas for improvement? Is there an email address? How would you guys suggest they contact you?
Yeah, so we do have an email address that goes out to myself and Gavin and Matt Rasnick, and that's understandsc@postandcourier.com. And then we also are always checking our Twitter. You can tweet at us, and that's also @understandsc, or messages there.
Gotcha. So I understand you've got an interesting episode coming up here in just a few minutes that's going to drop for Understand SC. Do you want to give us a quick preview of that?
Yeah, I can do that. So this week we're talking about something. It's really interesting. It's a little different for us too, I would say. So our arts and entertainment reporter Kaylin Oyer has written about this artist. His name is Mike Winkleman, but he goes by Beeple, and he just sold a piece of digital artwork. So this is a JPEG for $69.3 million at Christie's. And this is just kind of blown up in the art world because it is a piece of digital artwork, and it's now that's the third highest price ever paid for a living artist. And this guy just works from his home in North Charleston. And I think a lot of people didn't know that he's local here, but also our arts critic, Maura Hogan, she gave us kind of her take on it. She's been thinking a lot about it. She had some great thoughts. So this one's a little different. It's so some of that news of what happened, and then also Maura's really giving us some opinion and some critique at the end of the episode. So it was a fun one.
That sounds great, because I got to be honest, I do not understand that whole piece of art or how it's sold for that kind of money.
It's very confusing, and it took me a bit. So I'm hoping that when you listen, it's gonna make a little bit more sense. I think blockchain is involved, and whatever it is, there's a piece of that will always be mystifying. But I did actually, and speaking of like bringing on more guests, found a cryptocurrency professor at Clemson who gave us kind of a quick primer on how these work. So I think he made it make a little more sense.
Great. Well, I'll definitely have to tune in for that, because I need an education and some kind of understanding of how the heck that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, we're getting up to 12:30. We try to respect a half hour for our listeners and guests. But before we go, I just wanted to remind everybody that at the end of this, we will be sending out an email to everybody who registered, whether you're on live or not, with a recording of this episode of Beyond the Headlines. In addition to that, there'll be information in that newsletter about how to, listen to the podcast, where you can find it, how to sign up for the newsletter, like Emily and Gavin mentioned. There'll be information about our webpage, our social media accounts, all that great stuff. So you can you really dig in there, and of course, contact information for how to reach out to us with suggestions, ideas. We definitely, as Emily and Gavin both said, would love the feedback, love that interaction with our audience. We do ask if you're, especially if you're on Apple, if you could please rate and review the podcast. That helps move it up the rankings and gets more audience to our show and to the work that Gavin, Emily, and Matt do every week. We are on all the platforms, anywhere you want to get a podcast, including NPR One. If you set your location to Charleston, to South Carolina, you can get us on the NPR One app as well. But again, the recap email will come with some recordings and links to help you learn more about Understand SC. Before we go, Emily, Gavin, is there anything else you guys want to say as a kind of a last pitch for folks who maybe, there might be some people on here who have never listened to the podcast. Why should they listen to Understand SC?
Well, obviously, thank you to people who do subscribe, because really do appreciate it. And if I'd say give the podcast a chance, and if you like it, please subscribe. If you don't like it, please let us know why you don't like it, because that will also help us create a better podcast for you and people who already subscribe. Great.
I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I know we're probably all going to try to get into our cars or wherever we need to do to get away from the storm before it hits later this afternoon. I know we're talking about Understand SC, but if you're looking for storm updates and news, don't forget to hit postandcourier.com today. We have a storm team providing live updates all day, so we're there for you there too. Again, please find us wherever you listen to podcasts, rate and review us. We're excited about the work we're doing here, and we thank you all for coming out today and keeping an eye out in your inbox for a recording of this episode of Beyond the Headlines and more information about Understand SC. Thanks, everybody. Have a great Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.